He's got the whole world in his hands.
You are listening to a special episode.
He's got the whole wide world in his hands.
From the Riverbend Youth Podcast.
He's got the whole world in his hands.
We hope that the conversation around this topic
He's got the whole world in his
is helpful to you and your walk with Jesus.
hands.
Please enjoy the talk.
Okay, word of warning about this message. We're going to kick off a study on Genesis 1 and 2. Some of this might be a little bit different from what you're used to hearing or what you've heard before in church and Sunday school. But just know that these ideas are not new. They've been around for a long while. And it might feel a little bit tricky to understand at first. But if something's hard, do we run away? No, we lean into it. And we're going to do that today. So, yeah, these images I actually had ChatGPT render. So I asked it to render images of creation from a scientific perspective as if a 5-year-old made them with crayons. And my daughter and my wife were quick to point out, like, what 5-year-old can make art like this? I don't think that's happening. It's pretty gorgeous. So we're going to do a quick comparison of our modern creation story versus the Genesis creation story. So for a minute, let's just pretend that I'm a scientist living in 2024, and I have to explain how the universe came to be in just 60 seconds. It would go something like this. You ready? 13.8 billion years ago, there was the Big Bang, which kicked off everything. Over time, stars formed from clouds of gas and dust, and around 4.6 billion years ago, our sun showed up. Shortly after that, the Earth was formed about 4.5 billion years ago, and then the moon came along into existence when a huge rock crashed into Earth. Then, as the Earth cooled, massive volcanoes created our atmosphere, land, and seas. And life began in the oceans around 3.5 billion years ago, with super simple organisms eventually evolving into more and more complex ones over billions of years. Plants then started in the ocean a bit later, around 500 million years ago, and they moved onto land, eventually becoming seed-carrying plants. Animals evolved from ocean life and eventually moved onto the land and became more and more complex over time. And then finally, we have us humans. We evolved from primates about 300,000 years ago, gradually developing intelligence, culture, technology, the iPhone, the internet, etc. Anybody heard this story before at school? Yeah. So that's the modern scientific understanding of creation. But here's the key. When we read Genesis, we should not expect it to be giving us a modern science lesson. The Bible's not focused on the how of things being made in a scientific way. Instead, it's telling a much bigger story about purpose and function. There's more going on in the Genesis story than just physical details. It's all about the why things were made, not just about the how. All right, we're going to step back into ancient history. I know everyone's favorite topic, but we need to remember that when we read the Bible and we open it up to Genesis particularly, that this is ancient history. The story in Genesis is known to be about 6,000 years old. Now, that's 1,500 years older than the Great Pyramids at Giza, 1,500 years older than the first hieroglyphics. So when you think about Genesis, a lot of us don't think about ancient Egypt. We don't think about that world. We think about something a little bit more modern, but we actually need to be thinking that this is 1,500 years older than what we learn about in ancient Egypt. The other thing is that the Bible, it was written for all of us here, but it wasn't written to us. So if I was going to write a letter to you, it would have your name on it, and I'm addressing it, and it's a letter that I'm writing to you. That is not what we have in the Bible. Instead, the Bible was written to the people living thousands of years ago who thought about life completely different than how we think of today. So when we read the Bible with our modern brains, especially this creation story in Genesis, it gets confusing. And our goal should always be to understand the Bible in the way that the original audience would have understood it. So if we're going to get it right, we need to step out of 2024 and imagine what life was like for the people hearing these stories thousands of years ago. How did they think, and what was important to them? The good news is, thanks to things like archaeology, that we know a lot about the people back then and what they cared about. All right, so this is, again, beautiful ChatGPT rendering some images for me. So way back then, people were farmers. That's what they did. They worked the land all day, every day. No weekends, no vacations. 24/7, you're working the land. And they lived by the sun and the seasons. They planted in the spring, they harvested in the fall, and they rested in the winter. So what did these ancient people think about the universe? Well, their creation stories were all about gods giving functions to different parts of the world. The sky, the land, and the seas. And this wasn't just the Bible. This is all ancient cultures of the time. Mesopotamia, Iran, Egypt, they all have the same stories of creation. And here's how they thought about the world. They believed that the world was made in those three parts: sky, land, and seas. And they had some pretty interesting ideas about each that were much different from the way that we think today. So let's start with the sky. The sky, they imagined that it was separated from the earth by a giant vault, kind of like a dome, that held back the sky waters. The sky waters. That's curious. Why waters in the sky? Well, when you go outside on a beautiful, clear day and you look up to the sky, what color is it? Oh, that's water then. That's what they thought, sky water. And the sky water was held back by that archway, and when it rained, it was the gods opening up the sky windows and letting the sky water fall down. Yep. All right, what about the land? The land they saw as two types. There was one, the dry, chaotic desert, and the other, the fertile, life-giving land. And the way that a god would control the deep, dark ocean was to put land on top of it. Then that chaotic ocean would be transformed into something life-giving water, which crept its way up through the land in the form of rivers and lakes and springs. And the ocean is where it gets really crazy. Ancient people didn't think of the ocean the way that we do. So to them, something existed if it had a function that benefited humanity. So let's all imagine that we're being transported 6,000 years ago, and we're standing on the beach with our 6,000 year ago friend, and we're looking out at the horizon, and you said to your friend, "Hey, does the ocean exist?" They would say, "No, it doesn't exist." What? We're looking at the ocean. Why doesn't it exist? Because it doesn't have a function that benefits humanity. God hasn't tamed the ocean yet. The ocean doesn't provide function. It's scary. It's chaos. When we go out to the deep ocean, we die. That's what they thought about it. And this is how they viewed the universe. And it's super important to understand their way of thinking when we read the stories like Genesis. It's not about material creation. It's about function and purpose that everything in the world has. Remember, their questions are not your questions, and Genesis is not doing science. I'm going to give you another example that I think is super helpful. So imagine your family is building a brand new house, and you got the blueprints, the construction workers, all the materials. Now, this is a house story. It's about how the house is being built. Then you fast forward to move-in day. So exciting. The house is finished, but it's totally empty, and you haven't decided which room is the family room. Which room are the bedrooms? Where are you going to sleep? Where's your room? This is a home story. It's not about the building anymore. It's about how you're going to live in the house and what each room is going to do. And that's exactly what we get in Genesis 1. Genesis is not a house story about how God physically built the world. It's a home story about how God gave everything a purpose and made it work for us to live in. So as we dive into Genesis 1, remember that you're reading it like someone living 4,000 years ago. You're an ancient farmer. You're not thinking about science. You're thinking about who's in charge and who made it work and what is important to them. Ooh, Genesis. Here we go. So on the left here is the oldest artifact that we have of Genesis 1. You notice that it's just a kind of a bunch of clips, like remnants that we have. That is from 300 BC. And then on the right, we have the oldest complete copy of all of the book of Genesis, and that's called the Leningrad Codex, and this is actually from 1000 AD. Right? So the story that we're talking about is 6,000 years ago. Ancient history. Can you all read this? No, we can't read this. We definitely can't read this. So why does this matter? Why am I showing you this? We need to be reminded that Genesis is an ancient text. It was written in Hebrew, which is a really old language, and we've had to translate it into English. But translating isn't always easy. Some words in ancient Hebrew don't have a perfect English equivalent. So scholars do their best to get the meaning right. And the point is, when we read Genesis, we need to remember that it was written a really long time ago in a different language for a different group of people. So when we read it today, we're doing the best that we can with the translations that we have. All right. This could be the most iconic biblical passage ever. If you're a Christian, if you're an atheist, everyone knows this. Let's read it together. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. This is from the NASB translation. I underlined some of the words here that cause a lot of tension and confusion. In the beginning, created heavens, earth, and formless and void. So we need to get a better understanding of what these words mean in Hebrew and look for more accurate words in English that we could use to translate them. Yep, here we go. This is the time that you kind of put all that you think you know aside and relearn. Okay. The first word is pronounced reshit. Sometimes translated as beginning is not actually about the beginning of time. Instead, it's the start of a task, as in, I haven't started cleaning my room yet. Your room already exists, all the items in your room exist, but you haven't started cleaning it yet. A more accurate translation for this word should be began. Next word is bara, sometimes translated as create, is really about God assigning a function or a role to something. Assign is the more accurate choice here. Shamayim, sometimes translated as heavens, is really just skies. Like you go outside and you look up. That's heavens or skies. And then mayim, which means water, like rivers. Then the word eretz, sometimes translated as earth, actually just means land, like farming land. It does not mean planet Earth. And then this beautiful word, tohu vavohu, which is actually two Hebrew words that are joined together to form a single meaning. It's pretty neat. Sometimes they're translated as formless and void, and these words are used later on in the Bible to describe the desert. The desert is not formless. The desert is not void, right? This is really confusing when we use those translations. A more accurate translation is wild and waste. That both defines a desert and matches the scene from Genesis 1. And then finally, the Hebrew word tob, I've added in at the end there, which is not in the first sentence in Genesis, but it is super important to understand. The word sometimes is translated as good, which makes you think good and bad. Again, really confusing. It's not about good or bad. It's about function. And when you're making a claim that something is working the way it's supposed to, otherwise known as functioning. So that word heaven, it's kind of a mind blow to know that that just means skies. And specifically, it has to do with the sky waters. Remember, the ancients understood that the blue sky was water, right? So shamayim, skies and water, and the word for waters is mayim. You can see how closely the two words are related. There's just one character difference. So you have the sky waters and the land waters. Okay, here we go. First verse of Genesis. Now that we understand those words, let's look at that first verse from a different translation. When God began to assign skies and the land then was wild and waste, and darkness over the deep, and God's breath hovering over the waters. See how that changes things? God is giving creation its purpose and function. He's not creating it out of nothing. The skies, the land, and the waters are already there at the beginning of the story. They just don't have a role yet. The story begins with everything already existing. Nothing has been given a job. The land is described as wild and waste, and the waters are already there, but they're sitting in chaotic darkness. They don't have a function. They don't exist, remember? And check this out. There's no timeline. When it says God began, it's like saying a long, long time ago. Here's a story from a long, long time ago. This is before day one even kicks off. The creation story is not about making physical stuff. It's about God assigning everything its role, purpose, and function. All right. Day one. As we read about this, I want you to think about skies, the land, and the seas, which part of creation is day one? Should give you kind of a hint. Day one is about skies. Okay? Here's what happens. God separates light from darkness. He gives the light a name, day, and he does the same for darkness, which he calls night. To the ancient people, light and darkness didn't exist because they didn't have a purpose yet. But once God assigns them their functions, day and night, they do exist because they have a job. And what do we call the cycle of day and night? Day and night, day and night. We experience it every day. That's time. That is what God creates on day one. He sets up time by giving light and darkness a function. And then we have this other word here, day. Day is actually a 24-hour day, just as we would understand it. But if this story is not talking about material creation, then it's irrelevant if it's happened in 24 hours. It's just about assignment. It's God assigning roles within 24 hours. That's totally fine. Let's look at days 1 through 3. These are called the function days. Now, I don't have scripture up here for these days, but if you want it, it's on the back side of that printout there. You can read along. So day 1 are skies and time. God assigns a function for the skies to benefit humans. Day 2 is seas and weather. He assigns a function for the seas to benefit humans. Day 3 is land and food. He assigns a function for the land to benefit humans. And then we have 4 through 6. These are the functionary days. Day 4, skies and the time inhabitants. God assigns a function to the inhabitants of time, which are the seasons. So you have on this left side for day 4, the inhabitants of the skies are the sun, the moon, and in that archway, in that rakia, the ancients understood that God actually hammered in the stars into the dome. Right? That's how they understood it. Day 5, we have the water inhabitants. The water inhabitants are the fish and the birds. Why are there birds for water inhabitants, do you think? Skies, because the skies are the sky water. That makes sense. Day 6, you have food inhabitants. You've got animals. And notice, are there only 2 people? Is it Adam and Eve? How many people are there? Lots. Yeah, we're going to talk about that next week. But the word for Adam, just means humanity. Lots of people. And this is how they match up. Day 1 and 4 are the time and the time inhabitants. Day 2 and 5, water inhabitants. Day 3, the food and the food inhabitants. They match up perfectly. And that's very intentional. Day 7, the climax of the story, the big moment. But get this, the climax is not about humans. The climax is about God. So what happens on day 7? God rests, not because he's tired or he needs a break. God rests because he's finished organizing everything. It's like when you finish setting up your room exactly how you want it, everything's in place, and now you're ready to live in it. That's what God is doing here. He's setting up the universe as his temple, where he can live with his creation. That's us. When God says he ceased or stopped on day 7, if you were an ancient person, immediately you would understand that this meant the work was done. And when the work was done, then what you were working on is complete. And that means you go and you rest. In ancient stories like this, they're very common. Gods would stop working to move into a temple, and that's exactly what's happening here. The whole universe this time is God's temple. It's not a building. He set up the universe to function in a way that benefits humans. So the story of Genesis 1 is really about the kickoff of God's temple. His perfect setup so humans can live with God and he can live with us. That's a great story. So knowing this, the Bible and science are not enemies. Not at all. The Bible is not trying to do science. It's talking about purpose and function. So whether you believe in the Big Bang, evolution, or something else, you can still believe that God was behind it all, guiding everything. Science helps us understand how things work, while the Bible helps us understand why they work. God didn't just set things up and walk away. He's there for every step, making sure everything worked exactly how it's supposed to. Now, Genesis does not go into detail about how everything was made, but here's the key. No matter what happened, God was the one controlling it. So if the Big Bang really did happen, guess what? God did it. If evolution happened, God was controlling that too. Even if we're talking about something as wild as the multiverse, God is still in control of it all. You get the idea. Nothing happened by accident. Everything was designed with a purpose by God. Creation is not some random event that just popped into existence. It was carefully and intentionally put together by God, with him guiding it every step of the way. That is what Genesis is showing us. God's got it all under control, no matter what. Genesis is not a house story about how God physically built the world. It's a home story about how God gave everything a purpose and made it work for us to live in.